Welcome. My name is William Messakar. I am a master model railroader in the 4th Division of the Pacific Northwest region of the National Model Railroad Association. I want to welcome all of you to the virtual layout tour we'll have presented today by members of the NMRA. We would encourage you to find out about the NMRA and join in order to participate in these virtual tours. We have other virtual clinics and other activities for the National Model Railroad Association that we think you'll find a big help to your modeling, and you'll get to meet model railroaders just like you. So welcome to our tour, and I hope you enjoy it.
This is Greg Wright from Olympia, Washington, and talk to us about larger scale modeling.
All right, so you want to build an outdoor railroad, and this is my presentation on that. I'm a decent model railroader. I'm a sort of a gardener, sort of a landscaper, and sort of an engineer. And all of those seem to be coming up much different priorities now that I'm working outdoor. Had to show the picture of the mask. My son was very pleased to find a steam engine mask for me and sent it to me as things were getting going with the pandemic. So I don't wear it very much, but I do have it in the train room, and it's a nice conversation. Many of you have seen my railroad, my indoor 1/32nd scale mining railroad. I did a presentation on it earlier. I'm about out of room in my garage space that I've got. I really don't have anywhere to expand it to. And I'm figuring maybe if I worked solid another year worth of construction to go in there, and I don't want to do that all at once. So I needed another project. And so this is my attempt at another project. I've always been interested in outdoor railroading, and I even bought a Bachmann big hauler 30 years ago. I said it was for my son so he could play with it, but I've really had a good time with it, and he could care less about it. I guess that's the way it works. It wasn't a bad deal back then, and I was surprised that I could maybe use it again. So I built a raised bed. I put dirt on it. I was going to start my garden railroad, my outdoor empire. I had it in the corner of my backyard. And in my mind, I had this view of what it should look like. In reality, I had this after 30 years. It had rotted out. It wasn't tall enough. It wasn't doing what I wanted it to do. The fence had fallen apart. The only thing that really held up well was the plastic track that I was using. I was amazed that the plastic track with a coat of spray paint on it had not degenerated at all from ultraviolet rays and was still just fine. The only pieces that were broken are the ones that I broke when I was removing leaves and that sort of thing. So in 2019, I got the urge. I knew I was going to be retiring soon, and I got the products out from underneath the layout in-house and laid them out on the patio, changed the batteries, and I'll be darned if it didn't run just fine. And my wife caught me out there playing with my trains one sunny afternoon. I was really pleased that I could make it all work, and that got me to thinking, well, maybe this is something I could really do. I laid out some things and did some measurements to see how much space it would take really to do it, because I just didn't translate well from my indoor size to my outdoor size. I found that's been really difficult, but doing it this way, I knew I could at least get some basic measurements down. The other thing I wanted to do was use battery power. So balloon tracks, like they're on the top, work great. You can do all sorts of things with balloon tracks and not have to worry about them. So I specifically laid out a balloon track, and I specifically worked on what different radiuses I could come up with using the sectional track that I had. In September of 2019, literally on the first day of my retirement, I jumped on Amtrak in Olympia, rode it down to Portland, jumped on the MAX, and rode out to the National Garden Railroad Convention. I did that specifically so I could get the tour book, because I knew that on Sunday of that weekend, they were doing tours in Southern Oregon area, which just happened to be right on the way to the National Narrow Gauge Convention in Sacramento. So I got to spend a day looking at garden railways there at the convention. I got to start buying things from my garden railway because they had a nice vendors area. And I got the tour book for the layout tours. And the layout tours were just really fantastic and really made an impact on me. Here's 3 of them just to show the different kind of things that I was able to see huge trussels on the upper left there. I didn't want to build something like that because it was a long ways off that trussel if that train comes off, like 10 or 15 feet, and then it would roll down a hillside. And I don't mean roll on its wheels, I mean roll end to end down a hillside. So not something I wanted to do, but it was quite amazing. Nearly all of them had a pond, and most of them, at least in the Southern Oregon, California area, had koi in the ponds. Again, not something I think that I'll do, but I was really impressed by it. And then others were put right into the natural landscape. The one on the bottom was really well done in that way, and it just looked like they graded their hillside to run a model railroad on it. It was quite impressive. So that's the kind of inspiration I got for what I had done in the past. Like any good model railroader, I started buying too much track, too many locomotives, and too much rolling stock, and I ended up with a very eclectic combination. I have two Bachmann big haulers, one in the 27 megahertz and one in the 49 megahertz, so they can run together. And I've got a number of extra locomotive superstructures for kit bashing, log cars and log loads. Had to get back to my mining ways of doing things. So I do have 4 ore cars, but really the outdoor railroad is supposed to be a logging railroad. A couple of box cars, a small box car on a flat car to make a tool car, kind of a West Side lumber look, pictures that I had seen. So I liked that. A gondola or maintenance away car, a coach with a cupola to be my caboose. That was a fun little kit bashing project. A small passenger car on a flat car to be my crew car. I found an interesting picture of such a thing on a railroad down in California. What I read is that quite often the logging railroads would buy an old passenger coach or an old trolley type vehicle and load it onto a flat car and make a crew car out of it. So when you have this very eclectic combination of stuff you bought that you didn't necessarily need to buy all at once, you can come up with all sorts of interesting kit bashes. I have a bulkhead flat car to carry my finished lumber, a bridge and 2 trussels. You'll see where that comes in, and several boxes full of track that I'd collected over time and I was going to finally get to put together. So in early 2020, this is pre-COVID days, I cleaned out my garage and I laid out my track plan literally on the garage floor, used the blue tape to mark 1-foot grids to really get an idea of what it was I wanted to try as my first phase. Laid that all out and did my measurements on it and took it to the backyard space. And if you remember that ugly picture of my first railroad space, this is it. It's about 23, 24 feet wide, about 12 feet deep. And I took the information from inside, laid it out with the orange stakes outside, and was able to figure out that, yeah, I might be able to make this work. At the same time, I did a little work on my sprinkler system, made sure I had lines in each corner so that I could water my plants if I get that far. And since those sprinkler pipes are 18 inches or so deep, they're very stable. So I raised up those standards. You can see those pieces of white PVC pipe and marked my track elevation on there for planning purposes, knowing that those pipes weren't going to move. And that's really helped me as I've moved into the construction phase. I wanted to make sure that I didn't have to deal with water issues, and the yard slopes down here. So I covered up all the area with plastic sheeting, put drain pipes in, put stepping stones in where you'd stand to throw most of the turnouts, and really set this up so that the water would drain away and behind the layout and not be a problem. So I'm hoping that's going to work. The idea of only playing with this in the sunshine, I know is not going to happen. So I better be able to go out there if it's a little bit wet, and I didn't want to stand in puddles. I found this construction technique for raised beds. Basically, it's a pressure-treated wooden frame. The corner posts are cemented in like fence posts. And then it's a corrugated metal roofing, 2 layers of that creates the sides and fills up. And I filled that up. Those sides move just a little bit, so I'm giving it lots of time to settle before I go any farther. For the front, I used concrete landscaping blocks, and I was able to curve those to get the shape of the track plan that I wanted to build. Basically, that center point will be where two of those reverse loops come together, and everything will kind of happen from there for the operator. So if you're standing there, you're on concrete stepping stones. If you're over on the far right corner, there's some more switches over there. Again, will be concrete stepping stones. So I build it this way. I like these concrete blocks. They're not overly heavy, although after 200 or 300, you get a little bit tired. I wanted to make sure that I didn't have water pooling inside the layout, so I graded out the existing ground there so that it would drain to that drain pipe in the middle, and I took that drain pipe out and behind the fence. You can see the fence boards are not up yet, but basically wanted to make sure I dealt well with the water. After I got that done, I laid plastic sheeting down underneath over the ground, but on top or underneath the drain pipe, wrap the drain pipe in landscaping fabric, and now any water that comes down there should hit that plastic, move slowly towards the drain pipe, and then drain outside of the interior lobes of the layout. I filled up one side, tamped it as I went. That was a slow process. There's a lot of gravel today to fill this up. It's about 22 to 24 inches tall. Tamped it as I went. As it got taller and taller, I wasn't able to use the wheelbarrow anymore. I could no longer push it up the ramp. And so the last lift of material was by 5-gallon buckets. So that's a lot of material to move. Burr mentioned that I regraded my backyard to build my table for my layout. I didn't regrade the yard, but I sure brought in lots of fill material. Like any good railroader, I already had planned for an expansion next spring. So I had that marked out, was gonna be connected to my main part with a bridge. Like any impatient model railroader, I couldn't wait. So I built the first expansion as soon as I finished the main section using the same construction techniques there. The whole thing, the first expansion and the main part, took 10 yards of gravel. So fortunately I was able to, there's a big gate you can see at the back of this picture. That gate opens up to my front yard and to the main street. And I was able to get 2 loads of gravel backed in there. So 10 yards of gravel so far to make this work. Having a young helper doesn't hurt at all. This is the young man from across the street. Was looking for a summer job, and I was amazed when I told him I had a summer job that involved 10 yards of gravel, and he was eager to help and get paid. So he'd load the wheelbarrow, I roll the wheelbarrow over, dump it in. While I was dumping the wheelbarrow, he'd load the buckets, and I'd carry the buckets over and dump them in. And so it took us several times to get this all done, but his help was invaluable. It's interesting having a young helper. They can work you right into the ground because they don't seem to get tired as much. Fortunately, really young workers like this don't know how to pace themselves. So I was able to get him to slow down when he eventually overworked himself at the very beginning. Otherwise, he'd have worked me right into the ground. I did a quick estimate, and what I came up with was about 14 tons of rocks, gravel, stepping stones, and wall blocks. That sounds like a lot, but by the time you move it around, I figure it's more like 20 tons of material because all of those things get moved at least 3 times, from the supplier to my truck, from my truck to my yard, and from my yard to the layout side. That's assuming that I get everything in the right spot the first time. So building an outdoor layout has a lot of different aspects that I didn't expect. It's been a good way to spend the summer and fall. So the landscaping for this year is completed. I expect that the gravel will settle quite a bit now over the winter, and I will refill everything in the spring and set my final grade there. I've got a couple planting areas. I've started to put some plants in those. The track will basically run around the outside of the planting areas. All of the big rock that I've been able to get was from a person that was taking out their retaining wall and replacing it with landscape blocks. So I was able to get free rocks. That's kind of things you look for when you're an outdoor railroader, apparently. So I was able to haul those in, eventually get them in place. Well, that leaves me some work to do this fall, winter. That's a good thing since we've got lots of time on our hands. I've got to finish that fence. That whole thing came down. I really couldn't get started on this project until things settled down a little bit with the pandemic, because the first trip that I needed was to the dump. And until the dump opened back up, I really couldn't tear any of this fence down. It came down pretty easy. Was able to save a few of the posts and put the new fence in its place. I've done about 100 fence boards so far. I need about 100 more to finish up the project. I'm not counting the cost of the fence towards the cost of the project. That way I can convince myself that it really isn't as expensive as it's turning out to be. So there's part of the fence put back in place. I'm putting Kadee couplers on all my rolling stock. When you buy an assortment of things like I did, not really knowing what you're going to do, you end up with a number of different couplers. So there's the Bachmann coupler. It's a knuckle coupler, but it's not easy to uncouple. Here's the horn hook equivalent of large scale couplers, not exactly prototypical. Here's the Kadee coupler, everybody's familiar with, but in large scale, they come in multiple different sizes, whether you're modeling standard gauge or narrow gauge or 1/32 scale. I found a number of these 1831s at that vendor show down at the Portland National Narrow Gauge Convention, and cheap, so that's what I bought, and that's what I'm using. The conversion's pretty easy. Because I'm using a tight curve, I'm using a Talgo style coupler, a truck mounted coupler. I'm hoping that the weight of the cars and the configuration will work well outside. Those are some of the things I've yet to learn about because I haven't really operated yet. I like the kit bash. My original thought was that I was going to do everything off the shelf and not spend a lot of time kit bashing. If any of you know me, that's really not where I like to model. So I changed that idea really quickly and started kit bashing. So here's a shorty coach that now has a cupola and will be my main caboose. Here's the tool car on a flat car that I was talking about. That'll be one of the cars that services my logging camp. A bulkhead flat car with a fish belly underframe. That's going to take care of my cut lumber loads that come out after the logs are processed. And there's the crew car I was talking about. This was a different scale car. It's too short, required the filler strip on the bottom. I shortened down this Bachmann flat car. You just barely see, changed it to a single queen post there and truss rod and added passenger trucks. It's amazing the things you can do with a pile of equipment you buy that you didn't really know what you were buying in the first place. I've got to get my engines ready to go. As I mentioned before, I have the 27 and the 49 megahertz Bachmann big hauler battery powered radio controlled locomotives. I was able to find one of each. The 49 megahertz were much harder to find. They didn't make nearly as many of them, but I did. And I have ran them together so they won't interfere with each other. Then if I add something else in the future, some other standard radio control product, they won't interfere with those. Picked up some other locomotive superstructures over time. And being a kit basher, I just can't wait to make these 4.6.0s into something that I like better. I need to build a bridge to connect the two sections. So here's the main section and here's that first expansion. Working outside, I don't want to use wood if I can help it. So I've been trying to think plastic. So I've got some Bachmann big hauler timber trussel plastic. I've got some Aristo trains, plastic pilings here, and a Bachmann large scale bridge. I've got to build this across here because I do access the back part of my yard down here. So I've got to make sure that I have this thing can lift out. But that's about a 6-foot span across there that will have the trussel. The ground will drop down and come back up. So that's a project for this winter. I'm painting and preparing my track and switches. The switches I have these big ugly control boxes on the side. They're coming off to something more like that, and then push these switch points over by hand, or you can just let the weight of the locomotive push them over. So that's why these reversing loops work so well. You can basically let the train run through this way, it comes around, and it will line the switch itself as it comes back through. Also picked up a few brass rail switches, anything I could find. Again, not knowing what I wanted, I bought lots of stuff. I've got the garden shed that's already there. That's a perfect place for a protected staging yard. So staging yard will go inside here. There'll be a little short bridge that runs across there. And finally, I'm going to put real doors instead of the canvas tarp on the front of my shed, which makes my wife really happy that will finally be finished. So that's a project. In fact, I'm working on some of that today since it's not raining. That'll be a place to park everything when I'm not running, but be able to open up a little door and run out to the main layout from there. It's always good to have more expansion plans than you need because they find a way of getting built. As I was clearing the yard, I decided to go ahead and build another return loop on the other side of the protected staging area. It'll be a good place to learn how to build some elevated track that's not done with the landscaping block process. So always have another thing to build. Here's what I'm learning that's really different from the indoor railroading world. Drainage matters. The books I read, the actual experience of the first failed attempt helped me understand that drainage is an important piece. I've got to deal with that. Number two, painting is different. It's bigger. I can't paint in my spray booth anymore. So you notice that my kit bashing work has a lot of unpainted parts because basically those are going to have to be painted outside next spring or next summer. Weather resistant materials matter. I'm trying to stay away from wood in my construction of my kit bashing, but I also realized that I can't use wood outside very well. No flat plywood tabletops. That's the standard for inside won't work. So I'm going to try some open grid splines of some sort so the water can drain through them on the track that's not on gravel ballast. This is some of the stuff that I learned while I was on looking at those layouts right after I retired on the Garden Railway tour. Things are different when you go outside. I'm fabricating more metal parts than I ever had. Plastic parts work great inside for smaller sizes, but I needed metal parts for outside, and my metalworking skills are not nearly as good as my plastic working skills. Workbench space goes fast. I thought I had plenty of room in my workbench, but one large-scale car on there and a few tools, and all of a sudden you don't have nearly as much room as you thought you had. I'm using glue and mechanical fasteners. The glue joints that would normally work inside, I'm not confident will hold up over time outside, so I'm trying to use more mechanical fasteners. That's an area that I've got to learn more about. I know how to put in big screws like drywall screws, but smaller screws, nuts and bolts and that sort of thing is something I get to learn. And material, it's heavy. When you're working outside, everything is heavy. Even the pressure treated lumber pieces I'm using are heavy. There's a labor cost. That translates to sore muscles at the end of the day, unless you're the young kid from next door who just doesn't get sore at all. It's not fair. But there's a labor cost. There's a time cost. Retirement sure helps, but the shorter days don't. It's taking a lot longer to do this outdoor work than I ever expected. And yeah, it is expensive. But over time, that's working out. So I like operations. Some of you have operated on my indoor railroad, and yes, there will be operations on my outdoor railroad. I'm looking at 2 people with a logging theme with just a little bit of mining, moving maybe some coal cars around, estimating to be 1 to 1.5 hour operating session. I sure wish I would have had that this summer to share with people, but hopefully by summer of 2021, I'll be able to do a little bit of operations out there. So that gets me to the end of my presentation. Got some outdoor railroading books my good friend Scott Buckley got for me one year, and those have been very helpful. Just made a connection with the Puget Sound Garden Railway Group, trying to learn a little bit more. I know that come next year when I start running things, I'm going to find out all the mistakes I made and have an opportunity to rebuild things. But that just gives me more fun with my model railroading. So that's the end of my presentation. Are there any questions?
Greg, Pete Smith, are you modeling in 120.3 to 1?
That's a good question. The answer is I'm going to model to the Bachmann scale that they built those models. And that's where I'm going to work. And I believe that's the 1 to 20.3, although I'm not completely sure about that. I don't plan on building any buildings. Rather than have buildings, I'm going to have little placards that show where the industries are that we're switching to that I can pick up when I'm done, trying to keep the maintenance to a minimum outside. Now, will that change over time? I guess, and I expect that it probably will, because I was just going to start out being a ready-to-run type railroad, and obviously I changed that fairly fast because I do like the kit bash and scratch builds, so that could change over time.
I have a quick question, Greg. I looked at some garden railroading when I lived in New Mexico, and how, when you lay the track, are you going to hold the track in position?
So again, those are some of the things that I'm going to get to learn. But basically, I'm going to fasten my turnouts to concrete stepping stones. They're about 8 inches wide or 12 inches wide and 17 inches long. And I'm going to set those in place, and that will create the anchor for the rest of the track. That will set on a ballast, and then it'll be ballasted in. If that isn't enough to hold it, then I will probably use some spikes of some sort to pin certain parts of the layout down to the ballast. But that's an area that's in the learning curve right now.
So that's almost kind of prototypical in some ways. So that's cool.
Well, we'll see.
Greg, as Dave, I noticed that you have the structure behind the outdoor area you're working on. Is that going to be a backdrop, or are you going to put a fence in there, or what?
Well, yeah, that is the fence backdrop. That will kind of bound that in because my yard drops off at that point and then heads off to a main road. So it was a fence before. You saw those ugly pictures. I tore it down, raised it up about a foot. So yeah, it'll create a backdrop. It also, there's this walking space behind there, about a 2-foot wide aisle, so I can get to the back of that, which was really helpful as I was building it. And not putting the fence boards gave me a little more elbow room to do the work. It was amazing when I went outside, it didn't fit. It's no different than working inside. I scrunched my aisles down as far as I could and then crammed it in to fit. It amused me that the same constraints inside happened outside. I'm going to stop my screen sharing here.
You might want to talk with John Morrison in Kirkland, who has built a huge, big outdoor layout. He built it on pylons using steel posts, and then he anchored to that laminations of the material used for outdoor decking in splines. You may be able to find some material from one of the lumber dealers that sells that Trex. Some of it that maybe somebody didn't like the color of or whatever.
I'm working towards that second expansion area that I decided to go ahead and start is kind of going to be my first test bed of building some elevated trackage on splines, and I've got to deal with how tight the curves are and a number of different things. So that's kind of my test area to see what I can learn. But the thing that jumped out at me when I did the visiting of the garden railways is you don't put down a strip of plywood and put track on top, because all you do is create a place for the water to sit and your wood to rot out. And so I had to rethink a whole lot of what I was going to do just on that part of it. There's pressure treated plywood and that sort of thing that will help, but flat tabletops is not the answer here.
Greg, I wouldn't want to encourage your expansionist tendencies at all with this question, but on that area to the left, do you have the option of bringing a trestle into the garage?
No, but if you go the other direction, I've got about 75 feet along the back of my house that could go down to another area.
All right. Nice.
There's a fence between us and the next house, and when that fence is replaced, I've already got the stanchions there to hang the track on. You have to convince people.
Go.
Go.
Burr is the ultimate expansionist who uses every square inch of horizontal and vertical space.
Any other questions?
We'll be interested to see what you do with those locomotives if you're going to bash them into something else.
I'm excited about that part. That's probably something I'll get started at for the first of the year, is start working on my first one of those. I don't know that I'll have that ready for the spring or not. About one Gazette ago, it talked about the different logging railroads that bought little tank engines. Some of them were little Forneys from the elevated railroad. One of those looked just perfect for what I'm trying to do. So yeah, there will be a kit bash of some sort coming.
You have the little 12-ton Plymouth at DuPont that's narrow gauge, which would make a pretty good model to kit bash.
Yeah, the biggest influence on the kit bashing is going to be the mechanism. So basically, I'm going to scavenge down the mechanism as far as I can, and then I will put the shell that fits over the top of that.
Yeah.
I've done it before in my indoor railroading. So that's kind of where my plan is right now.
Hello again. This is another reminder that this virtual layout tour has been brought to you by members of the 4th Division of the Pacific Northwest region of the National Model Railroad Association. And we hope you've enjoyed it. And we want to encourage you to, again, find out about the NMRA online. Both PNR and NMRA have an excellent website where you can get information about joining and participating in this and other activities like our clinics that are held all over the region. So thank you for joining us today and wish you great modeling.